And the Q&A, perfect. The Q&A won't be, again, just so you guys can express yourselves more freely. Okay. So we've been talking about, being a good Catholic over the past couple of days. We've been focusing on how we can be a good Catholic towards God, how we can be a good Catholic towards our neighbor. That was yesterday. And also, we're going to be focusing on today how we can be a good Catholic towards ourselves. Okay. So I've used this a couple times now, once each day. C.S. Lewis's analogy of the boats, remember? If you were here, you'll remember it, but for anyone who wasn't, you have an analogy for yourself in living the moral life, which is just everything you do, everything you think, everything you are. And you can imagine yourself as a boat or a captain of a boat. That'd be a little bit easier. And you're on the open sea. And a lot of people today in our libertarian, in the ethical, not political sense, society will say that, morality boils down to not bumping into and sinking the other boats, right? That's part of it, for sure. A lie's only a good lie if there's some truth to it, right? But it's not the entirety. And so we see that along with that, and there's more to it, as we discussed yesterday, what we have is maintenance of the boat, right? Self-possession, regulating the shipmates, the crewmates, everything on the boat that is the human person. That's another essential part of living the moral life, living the Catholic life. And so that's a key thing, and we already focused on the horizon, our final end on the first day. And so we'll be focusing on the first thing I mentioned there with regulating our own boats today. Okay, so I studied philosophy as an undergraduate, and if you're a philosopher, which we all are, many American philosophers aren't true philosophers in the sense of lovers of wisdom, which is what the word means. And Socrates is our intellectual grandpa. Philosophy, yes, has been practiced since time immemorial, since Adam and Eve. But philosophy in the Western sense as a practice has only been practiced since the 5th century BC Greece. And so that derives from the life and the teachings of Socrates, which Plato wrote down. And when Socrates is on trial, because, just like today, when you speak truth, you tend to face some heat. When he was on trial for his life, he spoke about what his entire life was pointing towards, or what he was doing here, as revealed by God in indirect ways before the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so we see that Socrates goes to this oracle, the Oracle of Delphi, and she has written over the cave in which she dwells, "Know thyself." Know thyself. Most of you have probably heard that phrase, and it tends to be used not super well. It can be used better or worse. Many people today think it means know what you like, know what you want, know what you dislike, know what you don't want. And that's pretty clearly not what it means, right? Because sometimes we want, or there's an inclination towards too much of a good thing, or even a bad thing, right? So just because you want that, in some sense, doesn't mean that it's good for you. Doesn't mean that it's according to your higher nature. People also think, and this is closer to the truth, that would mean know thyself. That would mean, know your strengths and weaknesses. Know what makes you tick. Know what makes you angry, upset, etc. And then know what makes you courageous, what your talents are, etc. That's closer to the truth, and it's part of it. But rather what Socrates meant and how he interpreted it, and how I think the proper interpretation should go, is to know not me as in Socrates, or me as in Max, but know human nature in an objective way. So if you know human nature, yeah, you'll know strengths and weaknesses of our human race, and also yourself as you gain experience, but also what we're made for, who and what we are. And you can't treat something or someone correctly, right, including yourself, until you know sufficiently what that thing is, right? So we must examine it to see how we, as human beings, should regulate ourselves and those ways of acting and thinking, etc., all those practicals, which we are concerned about and should be, they'll follow from that. Just like the sun, if it's a clear day, if there's nothing blocking the sun, you can't miss it. It's right there. And so once those clouds are blown away, we'll see the sun for what it truly is. We'll see human nature for what it truly is. Okay, in my reflecting on it, and I'm sure there's more to add, and yeah, during the Q&A, that's also comments and listen, so I like that too. So feel free to add some stuff. But I see we have three key things to recognize in human nature, apart from myself, but also in a sense within myself. So we are both body and soul, right? Rational animals. Okay. Let's start with the last part of that, okay? Animals. So that just means that we share all the things that animals have, right? It's kind of a broad definition, but we see it practically in that we eat stuff, we digest things, we see things like the other animals. Essentially, we have 5 senses, right? And we have organized experiences and even memories, right? If you see an animal sleeping, sometimes, if it's a dog or a cat, it will kick, it'll move around, and that's because it's dreaming. So sense data, including remembered sense data, is shared by all the animals. So, and we as corporal beings, bodily beings who need sustenance, have the same aspect of our nature. So that's pretty obvious. Even atheists will agree that we have bodies. Now, there's a few who might not, but that's quite the minority. So this other part, being rational, what does that mean? That seems abstract, obscure. What does it mean? Well, you can just put it in the negative. It's those things which we don't share with the other animals, right? And we have ways of seeing that pretty easily, right? So we use language creatively, right? Little kids that use verbs, they can understand not just like a sentence structure. Imagine ad libs, right? That fun game, or Mad Libs, I think, where you have crazy ideas being put out, like the Post-it, what's it called? The mailbox said there was going to be mail on Friday, right? That makes some sense at some level, but we know that these nouns, in this case, a mailbox, doesn't have the depth of meaning, the personal character, in order to express a sentence, in order to talk, and express something like that. So we see that certain nouns and certain verbs, too, the way we can use verbs, we see this creative use of language in understanding things at a deeper level than just mere nouns and sounds and voices. This points to us being able to have some kind of higher capacity to our minds. And so we also see this in truth value of things, right? If an animal could read, let's say like an ape or a snake or something like that, we see that these kind of beings don't think in terms of truth, right? There's a famous thought experiment by a philosopher where if you have a caveman who's like sub-rational, a Neanderthal, and you wrote down instructions to find something on a cave wall, they would go to that place. let's say it's not true. It's not true that, I don't know, bananas or something like that are in this place, but they go there anyway. They would be very frustrated because it's shown that animals without this creative principle of reason don't distinguish between, okay, this thing might be true, this thing might be false. There's a decent chance it's true, there's a decent chance it's false. Stuff like this that we can see. This person lies to me all the time. I'm not going to trust them, right? Telling me this thing. This person is super honest. Whatever they tell me, unless there's like a really good reason not to believe them, I'm going to believe them, right? This is the capacity to recognize truth. And only rational beings, as part of our rational nature, have this kind of feature or principle. So those things are kind of up in the air, a little bit difficult to comprehend. But more common sense things, more obvious things, is that you have a free will, right? You brushed your teeth for the last 5 days. You didn't 6 days ago. You could have done that 6 days ago, but you didn't. Why is that? Free will. You chose to do that. If the Coke machine didn't give me a can of Coke when I paid for it, I won't tell it to go to confession. I might kick it, but I'm not going to say it has moral responsibility. So there's some objects we commonsensically know have a will, have a voluntariness about their action that can be rewarded or punished accordingly. We also see that guilt or a lack of guilt is present in creatures that can do things freely, right? Again, if I didn't brush my teeth, it follows that there's some blame there, right? And there would be some level of guilt with that, okay? And so we see that guilt is not a misplaced feeling, right, or a misplaced disposition when it's in accordance with a lack of something good that should have been there, right? It's a very palpable feeling. It's inside experience, but it's very much there in the human experience for everyone. Okay. So those are just some effects or indicators of a rational nature, right? They show us that something's going on here that's different from everything else we see. Okay. So the second thing that, should be pointed out is that we have a lot of powers or capacities, right? We can jump, skip, talk, drive a car, all these things. We can do a lot of things, right? We have a lot of emotions: anger, joy, happiness, surprise, a state of laughter, all these things, right? We have likes and dislikes, and rarely are these intrinsically bad, right? There are some people who, by disposition, lie a lot, but just to live, just to function, they still have to have, at least to some degree, telling the truth, at least to themselves, right? If they lied to themselves and said that, there was no such thing as stoplights, and they just acted in stop signs, and they just acted like that, then they would die pretty much immediately, right? So there's this will to truth and this recognition that functionally, even though some people will get out of it when they can, when they won't get caught, there's this inclination and then this repeated, or at least probable, action or movement to truth. Okay? And so with that, I would argue good things too. Of course, people have evil wills, and there are very seriously evil things that people do. But the fact that we're limited creatures who live amongst themselves in a very interrelated society means that you have to do a lot of good things in order to set yourself up, if you are evil, to do those evil things. right? If you get out of bed in the morning, eat breakfast, drink water. Even if you do really evil things, right? If you work in an abortion clinic, for example, you're still doing a lot of good things to get there, right? So there's this drive to the good, which people suppress. I agree. But there's a lot of good things you have to do to get there. So there's this kind of drive, or even if it's suppressed, unconscious knowledge of the good and true that people want to get in there or get out there. Okay. So there's many good things and many good powers that we have, but we are drawn towards using and engaging in them too much or in the wrong way. It doesn't really make sense, right? Here, on this hand is perfect happiness. Every time you've chosen it, you've been happy, you've been joyful. Choose it. On this hand, what you have is something that you've always been unhappy with. You never found joy in. You've always felt miserable after you've done it. On this hand is virtue, on this hand is sin. Well, let me choose the sin. That would be, I think it's going to work this time. After all those times choosing virtue, or choosing it before, choosing sin before. So we're nuts in a way every time we choose sin. It doesn't make us happy. But there's something in us that's drawn towards it. Some broken principle. And it's the easy way. It's the downhill way. It's easier to walk downhill than uphill. Here's the uphill. But the uphill always makes us happy. And there's something that draws us downhill, though, if we're not paying attention to what's going on, to what we're doing. So there's something in us that's broken. I won't comment on it too much for now, but that's just something that's there. Okay. The other thing I wanted to point out within human nature is something I've kind of been hinting at, but it's that we have an insider perspective, right? No one sits in a giant, airplane watchtower and watches the human experience from an objective viewpoint while everyone else goes about their day, right? No, we're all humans, right? We're inside the human body, so to speak. We're within that human experience. And within that, even though there's lots of pleasures, lots of joys, lots of good things, right? People say life's a beach. That's true. But if you stay on the beach too long, there's, clouds that roll in, but then they go out and they come in again. So while there's many good things about life, still interiorly, we feel and we know we aren't happy, that something's not complete here. I'm still on my way. So by the fire after a long day, you got everything done. Let's say you had a perfect day, right? I don't know what that would be for you. Mine might involve, going to the beach, going to mass, watching the jumbo shrimp win, something like that. But even after that, if everything went perfect in a day in this earthly realm, you would still be left wondering, what else is there? You wouldn't be satisfied, like a dog or a cat would be curled up by the fire. So there's something in us that's not at peace, and it never is at peace, no matter what we do, even if we have the perfect day, even if we do everything right in one given day, or our whole lives. There would still be that question. What else is there? Okay. So no one's ever perfectly happy here. And I think we see that, we're both the crown of the material world, right? We have the rational principle. We have all these things that indicate we're not just matter or chemicals, which in some sense the other animals are. But at the same time, we both have this material aspect about us, which isn't bad, right? We fart, we like to burp and stuff like this, but we also have this thing that's worse, that we are drawn down towards things which are lower than ourselves. And it's fine to attend to lower things, but sometimes they become addictive, right? If someone's, addicted to alcohol, nothing's wrong with alcohol, but too much of a good thing leads to a spiral, leads to becoming less than yourself, right? The Lord of the Rings, the ring itself, many of you have seen that or read that, it's enclosed. It encloses on you. And Sméagol, the famous character, is a human being, is a rational soul. He's one of the hobbits, or one of their cousins, but he becomes less than himself. He lives outside himself. He even can't say, I am Sméagol. He says that like twice, and when he says it, it's a big moment for him. It's because he's lost himself. He's not self-possessed, which is what we're talking about today. Okay. So the question is, we have all these realities. Now, what do we do about them? Or, when you live long enough, it's not really about what can I do about them, because I can't really do anything. But what can God do? What did God do to fix this? Okay. How can we love, to put it another way, as perfectly as we can? Even Albert Camus, the famous French existentialist, he was an atheist. So, you're not going to believe in the communion of saints if you're an atheist, in the sense that we do as Catholics. But he still knew that the point in life, the meaning of life, was to become a saint. So this is kind of contradictory. That probably bugged him. But he knew it, and I think that's part of the human experience. Even atheists will mostly be humanists, right? It's because they think that there's a condition that we once had or never had, but we should try to get to, that's over here, and we're here. And so through technology or various things, we can get there. But that's still a becoming into a something greater. Okay, so everyone has this knowledge that we're meant to become saints. What a saint is, that's disagreed about, but there's still this knowledge of it. Okay. So the same God who made the mountains, trees, fields, rivers, lakes, and us. So, though not creating us in the state, that's a whole different talk, right? We know as Catholics, and we know through historical evidence, became a man, and because he became a man, he didn't just know it from being the creator, but also from an insider's perspective. Of course, he was unfallen. But from an insider's perspective, he knew human nature, which is what St. John writes in his gospel. And again, that's partly because he took on a human nature. He grew in wisdom. He grew in our sense data, our sense experience. If you think about it, you do various daily tasks many, many a times before you actually have a rational nature, before you're conscious of it. And that's because God's, we would argue as Catholics, trying to get the rhythms of life, the rhythms of grace into your body already, to where it becomes automatic. You're just going out of your way to help that neighbor, which is anyone, as we discussed yesterday. Okay, so also yesterday I talked about what Jesus did on the cross, right, and how that makes grace upon grace, as John says elsewhere, available for us in abundance. And as human creatures, whom Jesus, who is both God and man, knows the best, He knows we are both called and desire perfect happiness in and through friendship or communion with God and neighbor, right? And we as human beings, embodied spirits, you can call us, we know that matter matters, right? So no one goes into St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and then if they built, like a kind of ugly 1960s or 70s church, no one comes out the same way, right? The same person went in, they would be touched by it. But when you think, the first one, when you think about it, that beautiful experience, all those sights, all those externals, only affect, measurably, our sense data, our memory, and what we see immediately. So unless you're remembering it, why are you uplifted? Why are you lighter? Why are you more at peace if it's not immediately before your eyes or your mind's eye? That's because your soul, your spirit, was lifted up by the beautiful church, by the beautiful structure. So you needed that, the externals, in order for your soul to be more in levity, to be more at peace. So matter elevates us in kind of a mysterious way too. Okay. So God, knowing our bodily actions, right, and externals, matter. And for the former thing, Thomas Aquinas says, in paraphrase, that sin makes you stupid, right? So when we, engage in behaviors that are bad or addictive, we see that we tend towards lesser things. Our thoughts aren't touched as by grace as much. Our movements, our rhythms, which I talked about earlier, they start to center on those things, right? Probably something like 10% of Americans think that God doesn't exist. Another 10%, I'm not sure, maybe even more now. But God, in a sense, just means something which your life revolves around. So all of the movements of your life is going to center on something, right? That's what, someone would say, a philosopher, who are you worshiping? Who is your God? And we would call something that's not actually God, in reality, an idol. So that's just like the modern language in the old together. Okay, so matter matters. It makes sense then that God sets up a sacramental system, as we know by our Catholic faith. And again, we're talking inside baseball here, how to be a good Catholic at a Catholic church, so I won't defend it. But this real heavenly grace, something which I can describe to you, but I can't show you in a bottle, right? It's in a sense immaterial. But this becomes transmitted to us through material things, right? We see this in the Old Testament. Many times, all these sacrifices, very external, right? These animals. And we're privileged in the New Covenant that we have a perfect sacrifice represented for us again and again at the Mass, right? Okay, so matter matters to God, and he knows that it matters to us because he became a man. And all of these heavenly graces become close and apparent. They come very close to us. And, we know this, again, I won't go into it, but with right faith, true reasonable thinking, we see this is passed down to us. Okay, so to get to the practicals here, in the last 10, 15 minutes. So how do we exercise? They say it many times in the culture, in the media, true self-care. And like any good lie, there's some truth to that. The term's used ambiguously, so let's try to clarify our terms as our intellectual grandpa Socrates would encourage us to do. So I'll just start with what I was talking about a second ago, point to that again, practicing the sacraments, right? So staying in a state of grace, going to confession if we need to, if we're in a state of mortal sin, going to communion when worthy of it, in a state of grace, These things are like the grace bus that we just have to get in the way of, so to speak, and it'll do the job, right? If you're getting hit by a bus, don't recommend it in actuality, but if you're going to get hit by a bus, you don't have to do any work except get in the way of the bus, you know? That thing's going to hit you. So just get in front of the grace bus. You'll remember that. One of my professors, he said that the most practical thing you could do is, there's many things you can do that's practical, but he said going to daily mass, right? And so going to daily mass, so important. We hear the public proclamation of the word, right? The word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and so we also get to eat the word that we listen to in Jesus. So the last thing within this is vocations, right? Vocations are associated with, affiliated with sacraments. And so we see holy marriage, holy orders, and religious vocations, right? And so with some exceptions, we see that these are what God set up to perfect us, right? There's graces in these things, even though, men and women have the same human nature, so are very much the same in a sense. They're also very different, right? Different likes, different kind of, interests, and God knew that. He set it up that way to complement each other and to bring each other into perfect happiness. So when these differences annoy, and they do annoy, these are actually the moments where God invites us to love, to move beyond just our emotions, which can get out of whack so easily. So marriage perfects, and priesthood as well. You're just basically a spiritual father, right? And so temporal fathers are called to be spiritual fathers. Spiritual fathers too, the priests here are involved with how we use things in stewardship, right? How we use the things given to us. And so they're also temporal fathers in a sense, right? So these vows, if you will, religious vows, and these commitments within a lifelong promise actually perfect us in a mysterious way. St. Augustine, our great saint and the patron of our diocese, he actually never lived with no people. In other words, he always lived with someone or some other people. Sometimes that was in a sinful relationship, right? And that's wrong. And he saw that later on. But he always lived with people, right? Whether he was bishop with his priests, that's how they used to do it, or he was living with his mom and his friends, his philosopher friends, and his family when he was a kid. And so he always lives with people. So we often think that, if I just didn't have this person in my life, I would be holy. St. Augustine would disagree with that. Okay. And he became holy, not in spite, but because of these people he lived with. Okay. One other thing, or a couple other things. Prayer, right? So we talked about this more yesterday in terms of other people, social interaction. But prayer being kind of the main or the central action, if you want to call it, in forgetting yourself, on getting the self off the throne, getting rid of that self-focus, right? So this is, I agree that we disagree for good reasons, and they're important on many other, topics with world religions. But all the major world religions, historically, have agreed about this principle. You got to forget yourself. You got to focus on others. You got to focus on God and others. So, not to make an argument by consensus, but if there was 100 people in a room at a celebration, and 98 of the 100 said they heard a noise outside, some of them said it sounded like a bear. Some of them said it sounded like a mountain lion. And then 2 people were skeptical of it, I didn't really hear anything. You would probably believe the 98, right? You wouldn't know what it was just from that. But there's probably something there, right? So in the same way, there's something, a greater principle we see later that is God, that is moving us towards forgetting ourselves. That's part of what we were talking about earlier, becoming a saint means. Okay. We talked about it yesterday. You should pray for other people, for sure. But you should also kind of mysteriously, and you don't want to only do this, but pray for yourself too, which sounds weird. That sounds like I'm praying for myself. That sounds like I just contradicted myself. That sounds like a selfish behavior. But no, I think it's a recognition that, many times during these prayers, you're asking some other saint, like St. Philip Neri, to ask God to grant you grace, to grant you help in a place where you need it. The same St. Philip Neri said in the morning when he woke up, Lord, help your servant Philip today, lest he betray you. So by that prayer, who knows? Maybe he would have betrayed God if he didn't say it every morning. But he was praying for himself, and he was a saint. So we should take that with some care. Okay. Then I would say, to address kind of the popular slogan that we hear today, and kind of, see what it really is, let's talk about self-care. There's a famous line by St. Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuit founder. He says that you should keep your heart always in a state of peace and tranquility. Okay. St. Ignatius was one of the most active saints ever, right? He founded a religious order that became the religious order, for better or for worse sometimes, over the past 500 years. Catholic education, again, sometimes for worse, but sometimes for better, is associated with the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus. So he did a ton. He planted the seeds for this, okay? And he was a great saint, one of my favorite saints. But this sounds like, St. Ignatius, if this is true, then I'm not going to have as much time to get things done, even for the kingdom of God, right? If I'm always worried about, how I am, how am I doing, I can't work for the kingdom like you did. Okay, so you can kind of think about it, what he's saying, in three distinctions, right? So you have kind of the comfort zone, where you're not allowing God to take you on this journey, to take you on this journey of trust, like Abraham, leaving his homeland to go to a very bad place, back in those days, Canaan. But he trusted him, right? And so Abraham wasn't in the comfort zone. Jesus, very much apparently, in the Gospels wasn't either. But even Jesus, even Abraham, I'm sure, took time to pray on their own. They read about this. Jesus ran away from the crowd that was trying to make him king, and he goes to a place to pray. He takes his closest disciples, the apostles, on formation retreats at Marywood in Israel. And so we see that it's this going and coming, as the scriptures say. You challenge yourself, but you never put yourself in a place where, or you're strongly tempted, it's more than probable, you're going to sin, right? You're never in a place where you're just in this panicked kind of state of being, right? You're always in control, even though you go out into the really depths of the world. Jesus was in a tough place by all apparent accounts, by all that we can see, right before his crucifixion. And he doesn't answer Pilate at one point. Pontius Pilate, who would have been as prominent or famous or striking as like a major U.S. governor, and that person says, "Don't you know I have the power to crucify you?" Wouldn't you be a little bit panicked if someone said that to you, who was as famous as, one of these great governors who's on TV a lot? And then Jesus says, "You wouldn't have that power unless my Father gave it to you." So he's completely in control. He's not, in other words, the third distinction I'll make, which is the panicked zone. Okay? So that's when we're in a state of a lack of peace, in a state of worry, where we don't know, we don't keep in mind, not always consciously, because that would be itself exhausting, that we're sons of God, we're daughters of God. So we get to this challenge zone. St. Ignatius kept himself in that all the time, but we never put ourselves in a place where we're careless, we're running around like St. Peter was when he was in the high priest's courtyard, right? He was pretty clearly in the panic zone. Even though he was doing important stuff, he was staying close to Jesus to an extent, but he was in a worried state. That's how he fell. Do not worry only about the devil, says our Lord, except about the devil. Do not worry about many, many things. Okay. So we got 15 minutes for the Q&A. And again, this won't be recorded. But thank you guys for listening. In just a second here. Okay. Any questions? It's coming.